Good evening, hockey fans. It's 7 o'clock on a Monday evening, which means that it is time for the last minute of play, proudly presented by the Belly Up Sports Network. We are the hosts of the Double Minor Hockey Podcast, and we will be going live on Twitter every Monday evening at 7 o'clock to discuss any hockey related topic, expanding on what we discussed on our podcast. You can find the Double Minor Hockey Podcast anywhere fine podcasts are found. New episodes drop weekly on Friday mornings. Before I introduce today's topic, Lambros and I would both like to thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoy this new form of content we will be producing, and we'd like to invite you to participate in the conversation this evening. Let's all remember to be kind, respectful, and most importantly, let's just have some fun. Today's topic of the last minute of play is regarding rebuilds. Anyone who has listened to our podcast knows we focus primarily on the Montreal Canadiens, and the idea of a rebuild has been one that has been heavily discussed over the recent years by this fan base. But these conversations don't just happen here in Montreal. They happen in many fan bases around the league, which is why we wanted to talk rebuilds today. Looking at different ways rebuilds can be accomplished, what was the best course of action for Montreal to take, and other rebuilds around the National Hockey League. All that on tonight's episode of the last minute of play. So Lambros, now that I've unmuted you and we are live on Twitter, first off, thank you and welcome everyone. We are really excited to do this. Let's talk rebuilds.
Mm-hmm.
The Montreal Canadiens are in the middle of what they call a retool, which has been kind of becoming a new favorite word amongst general managers, right? Because apparently rebuild is too terrifying.
Retool, reset, all that.
Apparently rebuild is too much of a scary word for some fan bases. They think they're going to be stuck in the middle of nowhere for the next 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is this is what it is, right? In Montreal, we are in the middle of what Marc Bergevin and the organization has called a retool, mainly because the organization was not in a position to want to move out every top tier asset that they had, right? And so this is where we are.
Mm-hmm.
My question to you, Lambros, is
yes.
I think it was 2 off seasons ago when the Montreal Canadiens decided that they were going to move on from their captain, Max Pacioretty. That off season would have been as good of a time, if any, to have done a complete tear down rebuild. We're talking Shea Weber, Max Pacioretty, Carey Price, and pretty much anyone else that has values that you don't want to keep. Would that have been the proper time to do a complete rebuild? Tear down rebuild? And would you have done so if you were Marc Bergevin?
I think when you look at that entire offseason as a whole, the Canadiens had the 3rd pick overall. They just had they were coming out of a terrible season. A lot of stuff going in the locker room, just very, very bad year overall. And it seemed to me that it was like the end of that core with the players you mentioned, Pacioretty, Carey Price, Shea Weber, Jeff Petrie, all these guys that have value, Paul Byron, Jonathan Drouin, just to name a few. And yeah, I agree that it could have been the perfect time to start a rebuild, a full-on scale, just tear everything down to its core and just restart everything with the hopes of acquiring not only young prospects and young players for the roster, but quality draft picks to help build yourself through the draft. So obviously they did that with Max Pacioretty. They got themselves a pretty good forward in return in Tatar. They got a very good prospect in Nick Suzuki, and they got a second in return as well. So I agree that if they really wanted to go towards a full-on scale rebuild, that was the perfect time with the perfect excuses. If you really think about it, that we just want to restart everything. Problem is, if you wanted to do a restart of everything, that means you would have to have left the GM and the coach as well. Basically give them their walking papers and start fresh completely, because obviously you look at the roster and you say, well, we can start from scratch, start fresh with the roster, but you also have to start in management. You have to have new voices, new approaches, a new philosophy, very similar to Ottawa. Ottawa, even though they didn't fire their general manager in Pierre Dorion, they went with a young coach in DJ Smith. They teared everything down, even from the Erik Karlsson trade. They got a lot of assets, a lot of young assets that they highly covet. And you know what? At this point, it was deemed controversial at the time for the return they got. But hey, they have an opportunity to have 2 of the first 3 picks if the balls drop properly in the upcoming draft lottery. So
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's the conversation that needs to be had when it comes to rebuilds, right? Are you willing to, I guess, sacrifice immediate success or immediate, I won't call it success, because if you're in a position to make a rebuild, then you're not successful, but immediate results in some games more than others. And let's not forget that one thing that has to be factored into all these decisions too is, will your fan base be able to follow through with a rebuild? And that's why it's such an interesting conversation in the Montreal Canadiens fan base, is because it is such a topic that is so divided within the fan base, right? We have some people in the fan base that have been screaming for a total rebuild for years now, and just strip it down to the bare nothing and just start over, right? Because clearly the unfortunate reality is, if your head is not buried in the sand, or if you haven't been living under a rock for the last 5 years, you are fully aware that the reality of the Montreal Canadiens is that right now, the way things stand right now, and the way things have stood for the last 4 to 5 years, it's just not good enough. This is 4 out of 5 years. If the NHL ever unpresses pause here, this is 4 out of the last 5 years that there will not be any playoff hockey in Montreal. Right? That is not successful. And we can argue about whether or not whose fault it is, or whether or not it's a good idea to just tear it down, not tear it down, or whatever. But the reality of the situation is, this is where we are. And it does not matter how we got here. The reality is, this is it. And there is a lot of good young players coming in the Montreal Canadiens organization. But if the quote unquote hypothetical question that I've asked you to start off the show tonight is, 2 off seasons ago, would you have entertained a full, complete teardown rebuild? Some of these players, some of these prospects wouldn't be here, right? Some of them wouldn't be here. Now, when I say full and complete teardown rebuild, this is going to be unpopular by some, for some in the fan bases. I'm talking about a trade of Carey Price. I'm talking about a trade of Shea Weber. I'm not going to sit here and say I would personally do that, or I would personally say yes or no to one or the other. That's the point of this conversation. And to any of our listeners out there, we'd invite you to please participate in this conversation. Would a trade of Carey Price and a trade of Shea Weber 2 years ago, to signify that the Montreal Canadiens are tearing it down and we are going to try to build new, would that have still made you interested in hockey? And would that have still interested you if you were a fan of the Montreal Canadiens? Now, my question is this. There have been multiple rebuilds over the course of the last 5 years, let's say, in the National Hockey League. Some have been more successful than others. Can a full and complete teardown rebuild ever be fully successful? Or can that take years? Because I think that's the other reality of the fact, is that unfortunately, here in Montreal, this is, like I said earlier, 4 out of 5 years that we are not seeing playoff hockey. The reality of that, and the reason behind that, is that the team that Marc Bergevin and his hockey operations staff have built has been flawed for years. And I don't know, is there a way to go to rebuild that, or to retool that, without completely tearing it down, which is what they're trying to do right now. And full marks have to go to them for that, because without trading away all of their star players, the Montreal Canadiens have managed to amass talent. Is that enough talent? Or are those efforts good enough?
The results show it on the ice, right? Obviously, after last year, and you saw the moves he made, in particular the Max Pacioretty trade, the Alex Galchenyuk trade, those 2 trades turned out to be hits for the Canadiens. Let's call it what it is. I think though it was with Vegas, it was a win-win on both ends. With the Canadiens, it was a lopsided steal getting Max Domi for Galchenyuk, given where Galchenyuk has done the last couple of years. So after last season, and I told you this many times on the podcast, the Montreal Canadiens and Marc Bergevin needed to, if they wanted to continue this retool, which, if you really think about it, if we were having this conversation at the end of last season, I would have had a different approach to it and said that what he's doing is right. He needs to have a stellar offseason this coming year to assess certain positions and establish that young core, along with potentially addressing for the immediate now. and go from there. You build off what you had last season. They haven't done that at all this year. Let's call it what it is. This team has been mediocre, an average hockey team. And I just want to I want to mention one thing when we were talking about the Canadiens and like their long-term plans. When the Montreal Canadiens acquired Shea Weber, their goal was to win the cup within the next 2 seasons. It is what it is, given what the players they acquired. They acquired a Stanley Cup winning center in Shaw. They went out and got Alex Radulov. They got a lot of veteran-style playoff hockey guys. And at the end of the day, it wasn't enough. You know, you saw that trade deadline. They got Dwight King, Andreas Martinson, Steve Ott, scrappy grinder guys that are, for the most part, 12th or 13th forwards on any other hockey team. But you saw that series against the Rangers when they lost in 6.
It wasn't good enough.
It wasn't good enough because speed killed those playoffs. Be that as it may, at the end of the day, when you look at all this, it is possible. I'm not going to sit here and say it's impossible that a retool could not be successful. But given the status of the Montreal Canadiens, you have Carey Price, who's going to turn 33 starting next season. You have Shea Weber, who's 35, who's going to be 36. I don't know. I know he's at least 35 years old. You have Jeff Petrie, who's 30 years old. Thomas Tatar is going to be 30, I think, next season. Paul Byron is 31. They have a lot of veteran guys who are talented, who have value, but given the status of this team, in which I think are not a piece or two away, that's the problem here. They're not a piece or two away from contending or being playoff contenders. They are, like, I would say, at least 3 to 4 pieces from actually being a competitive hockey team down the stretch, you know.
And you make valid points there, and I think the conversation has to go into a way of the reality of the situation is this: if this retool is to be successful, and let's say best case scenario, this retool means that the Canadiens are ready to be competitive again. And when I say competitive, I don't mean make the playoffs. If the Montreal Canadiens are to be competitive, which in my mind means continuous runs in the playoffs, right? Going past the first and the second rounds, at least getting out of the first round into the second. We're not talking here scratching and clawing to make it at 8th and getting your asses kicked by whoever you're playing against.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about winning out in the first, winning in the first round, winning in the second round, having continuous chances of going deep into playoffs and deep playoff pushes. The reality of the situation is, and the unfortunate reality of the situation is for the Montreal Canadiens, by the time that is ready to happen, Carey Price and Shea Weber will no longer be the players that they are right now.
Yeah.
And the other and the reality, and we see it, right? Because Shea Weber and Carey Price today are no longer the players that they were 3 years ago.
No, not even close.
Just Shea Weber alone. And that's an unfortunate situation. So if your retool is relying upon, okay, we're going to get younger, we're going to get faster, we're going to influence, we're going to bring in an influx of skill and speed, what is Shea Weber going to look like in 3 years or in 2 years when you're ready to start winning playoff rounds?
Mm-hmm.
Because you said it earlier, the reality of the situation is they took a step back this season compared to what they did last year. But last year, they overachieved.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in the fan base saw that, but the organization was not ready to, we overachieved, okay, but let's stick to the plan. And there's nothing wrong with sticking to the plan because you can get yourself in trouble by not sticking to a plan.
Mm-hmm.
But sticking to the plan clearly led them to struggling this year.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, they are not 1 or 2 pieces away. That means that Carey Price is your starting goaltender, okay? Mm-hmm. He's elite. He is, and I don't care who you are or what team you cheer for. Any team, any general manager would love to take Carey Price on their roster, okay? He is one of, if not the best goaltenders in the world. Still today.
Oh yeah, for sure. Top 5 at least.
He covers up a lot of mistakes.
Mm-hmm. But he's been doing that for years.
He's been doing it for years. So any season that you start Carey Price as your number 1 goaltender, and he's capable of staying healthy throughout the season, you have a shot at competing for a playoff spot. Yep. That's just reality. We've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
But competing for a playoff spot, and like we saw last year, you miss out by 1 or 2 points. You finish 9th, 10th, or you barely make it and you're the 8th seed. Is that really what we're settling for in Montreal? I don't think so.
It shouldn't be the case
shouldn't
either. But here's the one thing that I think a lot of people are upset with, and I think it's the most important thing. There's no clarity from from management. That's what it comes down to. Because unfortunately, with a lot of things, especially we'll take the Montreal Canadiens for example. The Canadiens right now are in the process of a retool, which is fine. You know, we last year we said they overachieved. Now they're inconsistent. They're more of an average hockey team, but they still want to compete. You know, the way I see it, and my personal opinion on this is make a choice, pick a direction, so that everyone can be all on the same page. Because right now, like you said before, the fans are divided. Half the 50% of people want them to rebuild. Other 50% want them to win, to compete for a playoff spot every year, because we're the Montreal Canadiens and our history speaks for itself, which is true. I don't blame them. But the reality is right now the Canadiens are a good hockey team, but you can't be just good to be a playoff or a Stanley Cup contender. You look at so many teams who took. If you look, I look at the Boston Bruins. I look at the Tampa Bay Lightning. Those two teams are so similar regarding their approaches to maintaining success through drafting, through shrewd trading, through smart free agent signings. The Montreal Canadiens are not doing any of that. They've had an abysmal success when it comes to drafting, and now all of a sudden people are splitting Marc Bergevin's tenure from the first 4 years to the last 4 years, which obviously you should never do. You know, you have to look at it as a whole. And quite frankly, the fact remains that from the time Marc Bergevin took over to the time that Marc Bergevin is right now, the Canadiens are in the same position.
Have they in fact regressed?
You can say that because I
don't mean to cut you off like this, but I've made this point on the Double Minor Hockey podcast many times, right? If you are going to look at the overall tenure of Marc Bergevin and the Montreal Canadiens and in his role as general manager of the Montreal Canadiens, let's not forget when he took over the job, he had a young Carey Price in his prime. He had a young PK Subban. He had the 3rd overall pick. He had an Andrei Markov who was still playing great hockey. He had a Thomas Plekanec that was still putting up 60 points a season. He had a Brendan Gallagher that was a young kid coming into his own. There were assets in Montreal. There was Max Pacioretty. There were a lot of young assets. And the unfortunate reality is, and I've said it again, and I hate doing this. I hate saying this because it's upsetting. The Montreal Canadiens have wasted Carey Price's career.
You took the words out of my mouth. That's what I was going to say.
The Montreal Canadiens have wasted Carey Price's career by constantly expecting him to cover up the mistakes. He can't score the goal, Lambros.
Mm-hmm.
He can't win you a game, and that's the other thing. We some fans in this province and watching this team get very upset if he lets in more than 2 goals because they know they're going to lose the game. Like, come on.
Listen,
at some point, the general manager needs to be held accountable, and as fans and the fan base have to do a better job of holding accountable the Marc Bergevin.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm not going to sit here and tell you that he should be fired and lose his job right now today. Although I have in the past, but I'm not sitting there and doing that right now. If you are a fan of Marc Bergevin, that's fine by me. But you cannot just ignore the first half of his tenure. He's done a lot of good things in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
A lot of good moves. But that does not take away from the fact that the first 4 years were wasted. And we saw some success. The Montreal Canadiens lost to the New York Rangers in the conference final. When Carey Price got hurt. Who knows? I still to this day believe that if Carey Price doesn't get hurt, they get past the New York Rangers and they would probably defeat the Los Angeles Kings for the Stanley Cup.
Give them a good fight.
They would have given him a good fight. Who knows?
Yeah.
But other than that, there is no playoff success under Marc Bergevin.
The one thing that bothers me about Marc Bergevin is that I think from the moment he took over, he identified Carey Price as being the face of the franchise. And to this day, he says it. Like, it's
Absolutely.
Price and then Weber, which is fine. But when this is your 8th or ninth year taking over for the Canadians, and the only thing you have to show for regarding building around Carey Price is the one Eastern Conference final appearance, it's not a good resume to show to other teams and to fans overall. Okay, if you identified Carey Price as the face of the franchise and the guy you want to build your team around, hey, I'm all for it.
Absolutely.
But when you have a core, like you said before, when he took over, the team was a very good young team, and they were, maybe you can say,
Look, there were holes on the roster.
But they were able to be addressed through proper drafting, through proper free agent signings and good trades. Unfortunately, listen, they overachieved, in my opinion, a couple of seasons, especially that first year.
Yep.
When it was a lockout shortened year. They overachieved, and then they got their asses handed to them by Ottawa. But at the end of the day, we're talking right now, Carey Price being 8 years older, with obviously he has the season accolades and still according to even his peers, the best goalie in hockey. But he's stuck on a team that is back to square one, but with a much older supporting cast.
Absolutely.
That's the factor here. When you look at the Canadians when Bergevin took over, and the Canadians when Bergevin is right now, the Canadians are a way older hockey team, a team with more question marks than before. Because quite frankly, like I said at that point, listen, they have a number one left-handed defenseman. They have an up-and-coming right-handed defenseman in PK Subban. If it were up to me, even though I loved Alex Galchenyuk coming out of the draft, you needed maybe an Andrei Markov successor. Alexei Yemlin was still a pretty solid hockey player. They had some quality pieces, and maybe a couple of years through, like I said before, proper trading, proper drafting, good development, we would be talking about this team in a different from a different perspective. But unfortunately, here we are now. We have, again, like I said, Carey Price, who's going to be 33, and Shea Weber, who's 35. I love both these hockey players, but the one thing I can say is I don't know how the hell Marc Bergevin is selling the Canadians to these guys, because
that's a good point.
When you look at these guys, they're coming to a point where, for a goalie like Carey Price, he maybe has 2 or 3, I'll say even 4 years of pure dominance left. And I'm stretching it a little bit, but at the end of the day, these guys want to win cups.
Yes,
or
they want playoff success, and we don't look. The reality is
cups.
The reality is not every team can be a Pittsburgh Penguins, right? Where you win 2 in a row, or the Chicago Blackhawks 3 out of 6, or whatever it is.
No, but
I'm thinking any of these players,
if they're in that position to have a run like that, listen, like we said before, anything can happen in the playoffs. But if they're on a good team, anything they can make the biggest difference.
I want to take the last 6 or 7 minutes of the show, taking a look at some recent rebuilds, complete teardown rebuilds, just to kind of get an idea of, are these as successful as people think they are, right? Okay. Because people think, oh, well, we'll tear it down, we'll draft young, we'll get young, and we'll be fine, right? Okay. 2 plus 2 does not always equals 4 in this situation, right?
Okay, yeah.
I have a few ideas, quick teams that come to mind in a very short amount of time. I look at the Edmonton Oilers.
Perfect example.
How long it took and they lucked out in getting Connor McDavid, winning the draft lottery that year. But they still failed for years surrounding him with good talent. I look at whatever the Buffalo Sabres think they're doing. That's one question that I'm not too sure how to answer.
That's a lot of questions for that.
You're just not sure. I look at the Florida Panthers. They spent a lot of money this offseason, and it showed it's nothing.
Nothing.
But this is also a team that has built through the draft, right? Young players, and we're not sure. There's a mix there. We're not sure. The Arizona Coyotes. What the hell are the Arizona Coyotes doing? We thought this was going to be the year, right? Trade for Taylor Hall.
Years.
That's true. So I'll even throw in the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the last 5 minutes of the show, and again, we do thank you for tuning in. We'll be back here next Monday night. The Toronto Maple Leafs lucked in with Austin Matthews. They could have easily not have won the draft lottery that year and not have picked first overall with Austin Matthews.
Yeah.
But the reality of the fact is, and look, I've said this to you before, and anybody in the hockey community, anybody that follows the NHL will make fun of Eugene Melnyk all day long, owner of the Ottawa Senators, and rightfully so. But he was not wrong when he said that whoever was rebuilding the Toronto Maple Leafs forgot about a very key and important part of a rebuild: the defense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm not here to shit on the Toronto Maple Leafs, as fun as that is to do as a fan of the Montreal Canadiens. We really can't say much because
The Canadiens suck.
the Toronto Maple Leafs are a better hockey team, as
Right.
is evident by the standings. Okay,
Habs did beat them 3 times this year, but that defies the purpose.
let's look at the overall standings. The Habs also lost 4 times to Detroit Red Wings.
So did Boston.
Is a complete teardown rebuild where we're talking gutting it. Okay, we are talking trading everybody a guaranteed success? I personally don't think so.
No,
Which is why I think Marc Bergevin and the Montreal Canadiens decided against a complete teardown.
listen, when it comes to a lot of decisions, whether it's a rebuild, whether it's a retool, the fact of the matter is it's always a risk. Call it what it is. I mean, you're either going to have tremendous success or you're either going to have results that correlate with teams like Buffalo, that correlate with teams like Toronto. Listen, Toronto has made the playoffs, I think, the last 3 or 4 years, but when you are out in the first round, I don't consider that a success, especially with the offensive firepower you have, with a solid goaltender and a pretty darn good defenseman in
Absolutely.
Morgan Riley. Listen, we could talk about the Maple Leafs all we want. It's a great example. But when you bring up teams like Edmonton, right? They took Taylor Hall with their first pick, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins with their first pick, Neil Yakupov with their first pick. They took Connor McDavid with their first pick. They had Leon Draisaitl as the third pick. They had Darnell Nurse as a top 10 pick, Jesse Puljujarvi. These are just 7 players starting from 2010 to 2020. These are 7 players that I just named you off the top of my head without even looking at anything. The point, what I'm trying to say is that Edmonton has been just the punching bag and the laughing stock of hockey. And like you said before, they wasted a couple of years of McDavid's career where they could have built off of him. They didn't give him wingers. Let's start with that.
Well, when they drafted him, they had 2 of them and they traded both of them.
There you go. That's number 1. That's Peter Chiarelli for you. I'm happy, and I've said it before, I'm a big fan of Dave Tippett, and I said to you he will have a tremendous success as a coach. Ken Holland, solid GM, veteran of the game, won cups. He has the experience of doing it more than once. So hopefully,
but the unfortunate reality is we are once again in Edmonton having to, let's quote unquote, call it a retool. They have to retool the team in Edmonton after having gone through 10 years of hot garbage.
Right, but and the only thing I could say,
I think
looking up for them.
Absolutely, sure, yes. Any team that has Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl on their team should be a competitive hockey team.
Absolutely, but when you look at the team overall, you have guys like Bouchard coming through, Philip Broberg potentially. They have a good core of guys coming through.
Those are recent picks, right? I mean, Edmonton wasted away Connor McDavid's entry-level contract.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reality of it. And I think, we will end on this. I think that is why wrapping it back to Montreal, I think that is why Marc Bergevin and the Montreal Canadiens organization decided against, rightfully or wrongly, however you want to look at it. I personally maybe would have.
I would have done it.
I probably would have also, but I can totally understand why they didn't.
Oh, yeah.
Because you just never know, right? You just never know.
But
not to mention, we don't have time to get into that conversation, but could they have ever gotten full value back? We never know.
We never know, but
go ahead.
The one thing I'll just end on when it comes to the Canadiens, after they acquired Shea Weber, I said to you before that the Canadiens, in my opinion, they believed that they were going to compete for a cup or win a cup within the next 2 years. That's my approach to it. That's my belief, especially with that offseason. After those 2 years, if you did not come anywhere close, I'll even put that, anywhere close to a cup final appearance, be it a conference final, be it even a Stanley Cup final. If you didn't even come relatively close to that, I would have said, you know what? This approach did not work. I'll see what I can get for all these guys and start fresh. That's what I would have done.
And you are not alone in that thought and that sentiment when it comes to the fan base of the Montreal Canadiens. And there are many fan bases around the National Hockey League that are screaming for the same idea.
I hope so.
All right.
I hope I'm not alone on that.
I hope so. I would think so. So thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. On behalf of Lambros and myself, we would like to thank you for joining us on the first ever episode of the Double Minor Hockey Podcast, Last Minute of Play. the weekly show proudly presented by the Belly Up Sports Network. We will be back at the same time next week for a brand new episode of the show. We hope to see you then. Thank you all and have a great week.
Have a good night, everyone.